Good evening. I'm Gwen Weaver from Lake Forest Meeting. I have been excited all year at the prospect of Tom Hamm being with us this evening, and I am honored to introduce him. He is someone I admire as a Quaker, as an historian, and as a Quaker historian. And it seems exactly right that he is with us for the 150th annual sessions of Illinois Yearly Meeting. I'll try to give you a brief glimpse of his many accomplishments without speaking longer than he does. After completing a doctorate in history at Indiana University, Tom joined the Earlham College faculty in 1987. He retired from Earlham in 2023 and is now Emeritus Professor of History and Quaker Scholar in Residence. In 2023, he joined the Earlham School of Religion Board of Advisors, and next fall, he will join the Earlham Board of Trustees. Tom is the author of numerous books and articles on Quaker and Indiana history. His books include The Quakers in America and A History of Earlham, and many more. Rather than mention all his publications, I invite you to pick up the handout listing them, which is on the table in the back. Tom is a member of numerous professional and Quaker organizations and is currently president-elect of the Friends Historical Association. Last and not least, Tom is a member of West Richmond Friends Meeting. He was involved in the creation of the new Association of Friends from Indiana Yearly Meeting and currently serves as its presiding clerk. There's much more I could say, and I will stop here. Tom will speak to us out of the silence.
Thank you, Gwen, for that very kind introduction. It's appreciated, and I appreciate the very warm welcome that Illinois friends have offered me today. Warm in every sense of the word, including all the good ones. It began with a weighty friend quoting scripture. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it, were the words of Samuel M. Janney, a minister from Lincoln, Virginia, who was part of the committee appointed by Baltimore Yearly Meeting to attend the opening of this new yearly meeting. Thomas Folk, a New York City friend, followed, telling friends that the aspiration of his spirit had been that we all of us might witness the descending of the Holy Spirit like that of the dove. Esther Haviland, another friend from New York Yearly Meeting, prayed. And then for the first time, a member of the new yearly meeting was heard. Joseph A. Dugdale, perhaps the best known minister in the new yearly meeting, remarked as we were now about to form a new meeting, he hoped our peace might flow as a river. And so it was with exhortations to mind the Spirit and seek divine guidance, and with hopes that peace would reign, that on the 13th day of the 9th month, 1875, Illinois Yearly Meeting of Friends held its first session. This evening, we mark the 150th anniversary of that opening session. My assignment, which I have accepted with pleasure, has been to describe the yearly meeting in its first quarter century, up to the beginning of the 20th century, to reflect on the challenges that it faced as well as its accomplishments, and finally to offer a few reflections on what lessons they might hold for us as friends today. In all, I think that it is a good story to tell, albeit one that is not entirely happy, both for friends then and for friends now. For those of you who like waymarks, So you can measure how much this historian has already said and how much longer he is likely to keep talking. Let me give you an outline of what I plan to say. I'll begin with an overview of how Illinois Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends came to be. It is a complicated story with some departures from what some friends at the time considered to be good order. Then we will look at how Illinois Yearly Meeting friends defined and tried to live out their faith, what it meant for them to be Quakers in the last quarter of the 19th century. Then we will look at the challenges and problems they faced. Next, we will consider the solutions that they offered. Finally, I will opine on how these experiences might be instructive to us today. Two prefatory remarks. First, I want to recognize Peter Lazerson's wonderful new History of Illinois Yearly Meeting, just published. I didn't see it until I had already written most of what I will be saying this evening, but I'm glad I had it available, partly to correct mistakes I would have made otherwise, partly to confirm conclusions that I had reached independently. Second, I will not be saying much about individual friends this evening. This is not for lack of worthy candidates. Even confining myself to the period 1875-1900, I had numerous people worthy of attention, any one of whom could have been the subject of a lecture as individuals. Jonathan W. and Hannah Plummer, Joseph A. and Ruth Dugdale, Elwood and Thomas H. Trueblood, Edward Cole, Elizabeth H. Cole, Mary G. Smith, Sidney Averill, Jesse Holmes, Abel Mills, and Caroline Lukens all deserve attention. Time constraints mean that I must content myself by naming and occasionally quoting from them. I have not been able to identify the first Quaker to set foot in Illinois. A good candidate is Morris Burbeck, the English friend who tried to establish a colony of English settlers in Edwards County in 1817, but no Friends meeting was ever formally opened on the English prairie. By 1826, a monthly meeting had opened in Vermilion County, and another settlement of Friends in Crawford County had formed, subordinate to Honey Creek monthly meeting near Terre Haute. Both were part of Blue River Quarterly Meeting and Indiana Yearly Meeting. These friends could not escape the greatest upheaval in 19th century Quakerism, the Hicksite separation of 1827-1828. American Friends split into two groups who became known as Hicksite and Orthodox Friends. At issue were questions of power and how it is exercised among Friends, as well as theology. The lightning rod was the minister from Long Island, Elias Hicks. By the early 1820s, he was articulating doctrinal views that his supporters saw as thoroughly consistent with historic Quakerism and that his opponents saw as verging on atheism. In Hicks's Christology, Jesus was not born as the Christ or Savior. Instead, Jesus became the Christ because he was the only person who ever lived who was completely and unfailingly obedient to the divine light within. And Hicks argued that the association of some friends with evangelical Protestants in humanitarian and reform groups had undermined Quaker distinctiveness. This could especially be seen in the tendency of such friends to make the Bible, rather than continuing revelation and the inner light, the primary source of religious authority. In one of his more inflammatory comments, Hicks said that the Bible had been so perverted and misused in justifying slavery and war that sometimes he wished it had never been written. In 1827-1828, 5 yearly meetings, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Ohio, and Indiana, split over how to respond to attempts to discipline Hicks and his supporters. An Indiana yearly meeting, which in 1828 stretched from central Ohio into Illinois, the Orthodox were the overwhelming majority, about 80% of the membership. When Hicksites formed, or to use their own term, reorganized their own Indiana yearly meeting in 1828, Most were in eastern Indiana and southwestern Ohio. Hicksites were few in Vermilion Monthly Meeting, but for reasons that are not clear, they were numerous in Honey Creek Monthly Meeting. So much so that in 1829, the Orthodox laid it down, and Honey Creek continued only as part of the Hicksite Indiana Yearly Meeting. It joined them with the significant group of Hicksites at Blue River in southern Indiana to form its own Blue River Quarterly Meeting. One of the mysteries of Quaker history is why so few Friends were drawn to Illinois before 1850. When the time came to move west out of Ohio and Indiana, Orthodox Friends preferred Iowa. But by 1841, a large Hicksite settlement had formed here at Clear Creek, made up largely of Friends from Ohio. Later in the 1850s, another settlement formed at Benjaminville in McLean County that became a monthly meeting in 1867. A third formed in the 1840s at Plainfield in Fulton County, and a monthly meeting was established there in 1848. 5 years later, however, it was laid down, apparently because other Friends could not tolerate the preaching of Plainfield friend James Bellingy, a recorded minister there. Bellingy accused the Hicksite Indiana Yearly Meeting of being more in the letter than the spirit and sharing in the pernicious spirit of orthodoxy. Thus, in 1860, Hicksite Friends had 3 officially recognized congregations in Illinois, other than the remnants of Plainfield: Honey Creek, the new group at Benjaminville, and Clear Creek Monthly Meeting, which probably accounted for about 3/4 of all Illinois Hicksites. They, with Blue River Monthly Meeting, made up Blue River Quarter. Other Hicksite Friends were scattered around the state. One observer thought that if they had settled together, they would have made up a good meeting, but they had not. Meanwhile, in 1855 and 1856, other Hicksites were crossing Illinois, but their destination was Henry County in southeastern Iowa. They came from Northern Virginia, where Hicksite Friends were the overwhelming majority of Quakers. But in Iowa, they were far from the closest Hicksite monthly meeting at Clear Creek. So they wrote back to their quarterly meeting in Virginia, Fairfax, which was part of Baltimore Yearly Meeting, and asked it to recognize them as Prairie Grove Monthly Meeting. This raised a procedural problem. Hicksites had agreed that those living anywhere west of central Ohio were part of Indiana Yearly Meeting and subject to its jurisdiction. Given the distance from the rest of Indiana Yearly Meeting, however, Baltimore Yearly Meeting decided to continue the Prairie Grove Friends under its care. Indiana Yearly Meeting made disapproving noises, minting that we look upon it as anomaly in the proceedings of the Society of Friends for one yearly meeting to pass over and establish a branch meeting within the extreme territorial limits as claimed by another. But it acquiesced, with the understanding that Prairie Grove would eventually become part of Blue River Quarter and thus Indiana Yearly Meeting. In May 1860, Friends from Fairfax Quarterly Meeting attended Blue River Quarterly Meeting, which was held at Honey Creek. These Friends, accustomed to large meetings and substantial meeting houses back east, were appalled by what they found. The Honey Creek Meeting House was a broken down log cabin. The quarterly meeting of ministers and elders had only 4 in attendance. The meeting for worship on first day had only 19 people present, all except the visiting Fairfax Friends from Honey Creek. So the committee recommended that Prairie Grove remain part of Baltimore Yearly Meeting. Migration, driven in part by the outbreak of the Civil War, continued until by 1870 there were 3 Hicksite monthly meetings in Iowa, and they had formed Prairie Grove Quarterly Meeting, still part of Baltimore Yearly Meeting. Some members of Indiana Yearly Meeting were unhappy, but others saw the actions of Iowa Hicksites as understandable, and so Indiana Friends said no more. This may reflect a growing sense that there were now enough Hicksite Friends in Illinois and Iowa to justify the establishment of a new yearly meeting. By 1868, there was public discussion of combining Blue River Quarter with the Iowa monthly meetings for that purpose, but geography complicated arrangements. Some thought that a yearly meeting that stretched from southeastern Indiana into Iowa was simply too large. Blue River Monthly Meeting might have resolved this by agreeing to remain an Indiana yearly meeting, but there was no unity there. Initially, the idea was to set up what would be called Western Yearly Meeting, ignoring the fact there was already an Orthodox yearly meeting of that name, which would alternate sessions between Clear Creek in Illinois and West Liberty in Iowa. The Blue River Monthly Meeting would agree only if sessions were always held at Clear Creek. That resolved, the name Mississippi Valley Yearly Meeting was proposed by Blue River and Prairie Grove Quarterly Meetings, and a formal proposition sent to Indiana and Baltimore yearly meetings for consideration. For reasons that are not entirely clear, Baltimore approved only on the condition that the new yearly meeting use the discipline of Indiana yearly meeting until it could write its own. And both Indiana and Baltimore agreed that the new yearly meeting should be called Illinois. Friends in Iowa were annoyed, but as one wrote, "We will quietly submit and not rebel, and are truly glad to unite with our dear friends in Illinois in the establishment of our new yearly meeting upon almost any terms." And so the scene was set for the opening of Illinois yearly meeting. It consisted of two quarterly meetings, three monthly meetings in Iowa, making up Prairie Grove yearly meeting, and five monthly meetings in Illinois and Indiana, making up Blue River quarterly meeting. In the next decade, new meetings were founded in several locations in Iowa and Illinois. And by 1890, a half yearly meeting consisting of two more meetings, Lincoln and Genoa, existed in Nebraska. Illinois yearly meeting was formed in a time of transition among friends on both sides of the Atlantic. With the exception of the self-identified conservatives among the Orthodox friends, most friends were giving up many of the older cultural practices that had distinguished them before 1850. The first book of discipline that Illinois Friends approved in 1878 showed this. While it urged that our members shall be thoughtful in regard to the use of plain, kindly, and honest words in their speech, avoiding extravagant phrases and formal compliments, gone were older injunctions about the use of thee and thou to single persons. Similarly, in dress, decency, simplicity, and utility should be observed as the essentials. Neatness and good taste cultivated, and extravagance and foolish fashions avoided as being promoters of pride and vanity, and giving evidence of minds drawn aside from thoughts worthy of an intelligent, pure minded man or woman. In 1898, the answer to the query concerning plainness of dress, quote, elicited much discussion, there being such varied ideas as to what constitutes plainness. No longer do we see justifications of plain dress as a hedge against the world, and using good taste as a basis for anything among friends certainly reflects a major cultural shift. The accounts we have suggest that while many continued to use the plain language within their families, its general use disappeared, and traditional plain dress became the preserve of the elderly. Similarly, there were no injunctions against tombstones in burying grounds, nor were friends warned against reading novels or attending stage plays or having musical instruments in their homes. Probably the most significant change was the end of the ban on marrying non friends. But other peculiarities were preserved. The use of numbers for the days of the week and months of the year was justified, as was the testimony against oaths. These are changes that were not confined to Hicksite friends. The very different course of Hicksites from Orthodox friends is seen in theology. By the 1870, the books of discipline of Orthodox yearly meetings usually opened with a long statement of faith, bristling with scriptural quotations and citations. In contrast, Illinois yearly meetings took little more than a page and a half. It affirmed belief in a supreme power called God. Our distinctive principle was the belief in the continual revelation by Christ within us, and that this was sufficient, if heeded, to save from sin and evil and their sure consequences. Righteousness was another concern, manifested by unselfish love to our neighbor, dealing justly, loving mercy, and walking uprightly before God and man. Sin, in contrast, was conscious wrongdoing, which invariably led to spiritual darkness and the degradation and suffering of mankind. Notably, in contrast to Orthodox books of discipline, however, it was not stated that sin also inevitably led to hell. Illinois friends did elaborate their beliefs in ministry and writing. Four elements stand out. They fit neatly into what was, in the late 19th century, recognized as liberal religion. The first of these was a strong abhorrence of creedalism, a toleration, even an embrace of theological diversity. Thomas H. Trueblood, a recorded minister in Blue River Monthly Meeting, summed up this view in 1900. I think it right that we should have different opinions. It leads to development, and rightly viewed, it is the spice of spiritual life. This was apparently so taken for granted that few Illinois friends commented on it. This perspective was affirmed in the 1878 and 1892 books of discipline. Differences of doctrinal belief that do not bring discord into the society or disgrace upon its profession are not to be causes for disciplinary treatment, as one honestly striving after the right and recognizing the divinity in man can, according to our faith, be safely led to this guidance while we maintain fellowship with them so far as practicable as helpers. This left open the possibility that certain opinions might be so terrible as to require official repudiation, but they were not defined, and if there ever were any such cases, I have not found record of them. The second was the conviction that the heart of Quaker faith was the inner light. Thus, at yearly meetings, sessions in 1893, the Friends Intelligencer reported that strong testimony was borne to the efficacy of the inner light, showing it to be the basic principle upon which our society built, the phrase mind the light being a legacy left by George Fox and distinguishing and is the distinguishing feature between our society and other denominations. Mary G. Smith, a recorded minister of Benjaminville Monthly Meeting, described the inner light this way. When man was created, we find a something comparable to a cup given in the hidden life. And in this cup, a design seed was placed to grow and protect the divine life. And it is only as we heed the movings of this seed that it germinates and enlarges until we become so filled with its power that our cup becomes, as it were, full, and the overflowing baptizes us into a oneness with God. Jonathan W. Plummer, the first clerk of the men's yearly meeting, thought that obedience to the inner light would remove the occasion for doctrinal or theological disputes. If we are right in our belief, this would gradually clear the mind of all hindering or useless beliefs faster than would be possible by direct attacks upon them by us of different beliefs. Anyone reading accounts of Illinois yearly meeting in this period will be struck with how saturated the ministry was with Christian language and imagery. The inner light was inseparable from Christ. No one seems to have disputed the idea of Christ within the hope of glory. Sidney Averill, another minister from Benjaminville Monthly Meeting, wrote in 1875 how he was pained by those who would make religion a mere refined morality, the Son of God reduced to a skeleton of the principle that it adheres to the human intellect. The yearly meeting in 1877 made a long statement about the nature of Christ. Christ we accept as the Son of God, having all power from the Father. As God is a spirit, his Son must be spiritual, like begetting like. Christ came to usher in the fuller and purer dispensation of God as direct teacher of each soul through Christ his Son, the inward light of that soul. The office of Christ is to redeem us out of our sinful state and save us from returning into it. He reveals to each seeking soul the divine will concerning it and pleads with us for the acceptance of this will. A saving faith in Jesus Christ consists in a belief in the existence of this voice, light or power within our souls, sufficiently strong to lead us to listen for and obey it until a change is wrought in our springs of action from selfish or satanic to unselfish or Christ-like motives, causing more uniform and persistent effort for our own purification and right living, and more zeal for the welfare of others. Nevertheless, Illinois Hicksites often articulated and certainly tolerated a Christology that continued the teachings of Elias Hicks. One friend from Padua, Illinois, was blunt. I am a Unitarian, a believer in an undivided divinity. Illinois Hicksites dismissed evangelical doctrines like salvation through the atoning blood of Christ shed on the cross. For them, it was inconceivable that a loving God could have required the death of an innocent person to make the forgiveness of human sin possible. I cannot conceive how such a wicked deed could be construed to be right, wrote Thomas H. Trueblood. Instead, Illinois friends argued that the life of Christ was more important than his death. The life modeled what all Christians should aspire to, and thus should be the center of their faith. Abel Mills, a weighty Clear Creek friend, acknowledged the many and various views held concerning the scriptures of truth in the yearly meeting. Significantly, only a handful of Illinois friends found that grounds for worry. In all of these, Illinois yearly meeting distanced itself from its Orthodox Quaker neighbors. In the 1870s, most of the Orthodox meetings in the Midwest, including those in Illinois and especially in Iowa, became swept up in a wave of revivalism. How that came to be is a complicated story that I have dealt with elsewhere. By 1900, such friends had largely become the Friends Church. They called pastors and made music an integral part of their programmed worship. Theologically, many were taking their cues from the emerging fundamentalist movement. In Chicago, they would have been more comfortable at Moody Bible Institute than they would have been worshiping with Jonathan and Hannah Plummer. An Iowa Hicksite described an attempt at meeting for worship with Orthodox friends in 1885. It foundered when the Orthodox insisted on opening the meeting with a prayer and reading from the Bible. A few Orthodox friends in Iowa joined the Hicksites after such experiences. In 1903, the Plumbers, on a visit to California, went to the Pasadena Friends Church. They found the people friendly and the pastor a good speaker, but it was, Hannah concluded, not a friends meeting. Illinois Friends were fully committed to what one characterized as the sweet ministry of philanthropy, what the yearly meeting in 1894 called Christianity crystallized. By the end of the century, the Philanthropic Committee was by far the largest of all of the yearly meetings committees, and it had 9 subcommittees: correct literature and social purity, Indian affairs, lotteries and gambling, peace and arbitration, prevention of cruelty, criminal reform and prison affairs, temperance, educational interests, and tobacco and narcotics. Some were very large. In 1895, for example, the Committee on Correct Literature and Social Purity had 22 members. A sampling of the work of some of these will give a sense of the social vision of Illinois Friends. Almost from the beginning, there was a yearly meeting committee on prison affairs. It sent out detailed questionnaires to jails and prisons and urged members to act locally and individually. And they did. In 1880, members of Chicago Monthly Meetings Committee on Prison Reform visited the state prison at Joliet. In 1884, friends from Blue River were going to the state prison in Jeffersonville, Indiana, on first days to teach classes and distribute literature. The 1888 yearly meeting minutes show that friends were concerned not only with prisoners, but with their families and providing opportunities for the newly released. They urged specific reforms, such as shortening sentences for good behavior, individual cells, the removal of corrupt pardoning board officials, the appointment of conscientious Christian wardens and jailers, and, of course, the abolition of the death penalty. A particular interest was in obtaining legal mandates for the appointment of a matron to take charge of women prisoners in every jail and prison. But friends also saw themselves as realistic. Too much sympathy is often hurtful to prisoners, where it leads to overlooking the wrong done, a yearly meeting committee concluded in 1881. Consciousness of having done wrong must precede genuine repentance, and repentance and amendment must precede pardon and liberty. One testimony that united friends of all persuasions in the 19th century was that against the use of intoxicating beverages. I find it revealing that in the 1892 revision of its discipline, Illinois Yearly Meeting took for granted that friends would not use alcoholic beverages for social purposes. The cautions instead were to avoid the use of wines, brandies, or other injurious stimulants in the preparation of food, also to observe caution in the use of intoxicating liquors and opium for medical purposes. Friends agreed that most of the evils in the world could be traced back to demon rum. As early as 1864, Clear Creek Friends were trying to close down a saloon in Magnolia. Many friends were active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They urged state legislatures to mandate the teaching of scientific temperance in the public schools. Friends were advised when voting to carefully consider our testimony against intemperance and kindred evils, and neither accept any office nor vote for anyone under circumstances that will compromise these principles. Most friends appear to have been ardent supporters of prohibition. Elizabeth H. Cole of Benjaminville, for example, wanted friends to come out boldly and fearlessly in support of it. Friends in Nebraska distributed literature urging a dry vote during an 1892 referendum there. Chicago Friends that same year mourned that we are almost helpless in our chief city as an organized power because of our scant numbers to fight the saloon. But some friends had doubts. At a conference in 1898, Albert T. Mills of Clear Creek agreed that saloons were evil places, but argued that men went there because of their social functions. Prohibition would not remove that need, one that he urged friends to meet. Many older friends in the yearly meeting, especially in Iowa, had been active in the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad before the Civil War. Thus, it is surprising to find that they gave relatively little attention to African Americans after 1875. Some individuals expressed concerns, like the Benjaminville Friend in 1884, who worried that Southern blacks faced servile political slavery worse, if possible, than the chattel slavery. One who had taught in black schools during Reconstruction concluded that we find much the same characteristics we find in the white race. The color seems only to be the outward coating. By the end of the century, Illinois Friends called on the federal government to prevent lynching and other forms of racial violence. The philanthropic committee sent small sums to the black schools that Hicksite Friends supported in South Carolina and occasionally shared a letter of thanks. Yet an 1895 Blue River Monthly meeting questioned even this. In view of the very limited opportunities for better education of our own children, duty would seem to indicate that there was a wide field for the exercise of charities in this line nearer home. The philanthropic enterprise, which Friends today are most likely to view with least approval, is the work of the Committee on Indian Affairs. Here, a bit of background is necessary. Friends prided themselves on their history of treating indigenous peoples with kindness and justice. Certainly, Friends could point to many instances where they tried to intervene to prevent unjust treatment by government officials. Yet, Friends never doubted that the only course for Native peoples was to give up traditional ways and take up the lives of small farmers. In 1869, President Ulysses S. Grant, despairing of reforming the corrupt Bureau of Indian Affairs, decided to turn over government work with tribes in the trans-Mississippi West to religious bodies. Denominations were invited to apply for agencies. This was labeled the Grant Peace Policy or even his Quaker Policy. Both Orthodox and Hicksite Friends received agencies. For Hicksites, it was the Pawnee, Omaha, and Oto in Nebraska. The sixth Hicksite yearly meeting set up a committee to raise funds and went to work enthusiastically, opening schools and instructing men in farming and women in domestic skills. The results were uneven. Indigenous peoples proved recalcitrant in accepting instruction, and Friends often incurred the ill will of white neighbors and politicians by trying to defend Indian lands from incursions. By the time Illinois Yearly Meeting was formed, Hicksites maintained only one Indian agent. On one hand, Illinois Friends were determined to see indigenous peoples treated with kindness and justice and were blunt in acknowledging white wrongdoing. The history of colonization in America proves in a too common way that man's inhumanity to man make thousands mourn, was the assessment of Sidney Averill. Friends pointed out that when violence erupted between whites and Indians, whites were almost always the aggressors. But when Indians retaliated, the army was called in and Native Americans received the blame. Friends urged faithful observance of all treaty obligations. They also tried to intervene when agents and sutlers proved dishonest. Unlike almost all other denominations, Hicksites did not impose their faith on Native peoples. Yet Illinois Friends generally judged Native peoples by their progress toward white standards of domesticity and civilization. Thus, a friend who lived near a reservation in Iowa reported his disappointment that the remnants of the tribes here collected seemed virtually at a standstill. The school is but indifferently patronized, and they seem quite content with their half-savage, half-civilized course of living. Isaiah Leitner, a former agent who apparently guided the early meeting's work after 1879, called in effect for the dissolution of tribal identities. First, the sale of liquor on reservations should be forbidden. Then, the Indian taught to be industrious and obedient to the laws made a citizen, and required to respect and obey the laws of our land. In 1900, Leitner noted disapprovingly how, quote, non-progressives refuse to educate their children. One sees both genuine concern and chilling obliviousness in his conclusion. The only remedy which seems adequate to relieve the deplorable condition is a law compelling the attendance of all Indian children at the agency boarding school during the school year, and extending the strong arm of the law over all of these Indians to the end that they may be protected from the evil designs of disreputable white men who are actuated by purely selfish motives in their unwarranted interference in the affairs of the tribes. If the work of the Indian Affairs Committee in retrospect is disappointing, the commitment of Illinois Friends to peace work is more heartening. They were at the center of organized peace activism in both Illinois and Iowa. When the Illinois State Peace Society was organized in 1878, 16 of its 35 members were Clear Creek Friends. In 1889, the yearly meeting sent an exhibit on peace to the Paris World Fair, which won a gold medal. When the World's Columbian Exposition was held in Chicago in 1893, the yearly meeting protested the prominence of military display in the opening ceremonies. The yearly meeting Peace Committee sent out articles to local newspapers, some of which were printed. Two monthly meetings in 1889 reported that they had standing committees for the peaceful settlement of neighborhood disputes, and Friends in other meetings were efficient in preventing legal suits and standing quarrels in their neighborhoods. One group was known among their friends as the Peacemakers. Arbitration of international disputes was a favorite cause. In 1883, Jonathan W. Plummer was convinced that peace sentiment was growing from a higher appreciation of moral courage and the Christian principle of self-denial for the good of others, with the consequent lessening of the honor heretofore attached to mere physical courage and prowess. Still, few Friends were absolute non-resistants. The 1892 Book of Discipline acknowledged the need of law and order, which in the present condition of mankind can perhaps only be maintained by governments resting on human authority. For Elwood Trueblood, that meant recognizing that a well-trained and well-disciplined army was better than one that was neither. In 1899, the Peace Committee was disheartened by the recently concluded Spanish-American War and subsequent American actions in the Philippines. But it warned against carping and criticism as counterproductive. Let us rather, with averted gaze, spread the mantle of charity over its many imperfections, and join our efforts with all great endeavors to solve the perplexing questions confronting us, so that our beloved nation may soon be able to call home its armies and navies and unfurl the white banner of peace over all her wide domain. One surprise is how little attention, at least officially, Illinois Friends gave the women's rights movement before 1900, particularly because Hicksite Friends had been central to its creation. In 1869, Henry K. Smith, a Clear Creek Friend, offered an oration calling for equal rights for women. That same year, Iowa Hicksites helped form the Iowa Woman Suffrage Association. But in yearly meeting sessions, the subject received little attention. When the yearly meeting opened, it preserved the old structure of parallel meetings for business of men and women friends. The 1878 Book of Discipline, however, made provision for joint sessions if local meetings desired them. Marietta monthly meeting in Iowa had held joint sessions since opening in 1869. The yearly meeting also affirmed, believing that male and female are one in Christ, we recognize no distinction of sex in the privileges or offices of the society, granting the first to all equally, and appointing to the latter with a view only to individual qualification for the service provided. In 1886, it was the women's yearly meeting that minuted, "There is hope among us that ere long there will be no partition wall between the sexes, that each needs the sympathy and help of the other." The meetings were united in 1887, but that came with some regret. When a formal proposal came to the women's yearly meeting from the men, much feeling was expressed, both for and against the proposed move. And the minutes record that in the first combined session, there seemed to be a shadow hanging over this new order of things. What lately surprises many contemporary friends is how much Illinois friends took for granted conventional gender roles, particularly in the reports from the Committee on Correct Literature and Social Purity. The assumption is that Quaker women would be wives and mothers. Motherhood, the highest, most holy, and sacred office that can be confirmed on woman, was the statement of the committee in 1900. To be sure, it acknowledged that women could also be teacher, lawyer, physician, painter, or in any other profession. The yearly meeting also attacked the double standard of sexual purity, urging that men be held to the same morality as women. In 1898, the committee issued a statement. "We would urge upon fathers the necessity of impressing upon their sons, as they approach maturity, the beauty and value of purity of life. That in marriage as high a degree of purity should be demanded in the husband and the wife, and that on the authority of our best and most experienced physicians, a pure continent life is consonant with the best physical and mental health." Certainly from the beginning, Illinois Yearly Meeting faced challenges. Even before the yearly meeting was organized, Indiana Yearly Meeting had expressed concern about the scattered situation of the meetings constituting Blue River Quarter and the fewness of its members. Rachel Hicks, a minister from Long Island, recorded the distances she traveled in 1872 when visiting the meetings soon to become Illinois Yearly Meeting. 147 miles from Blue River to Honey Creek, then 186 miles to Benjaminville, then 100 miles to Plainfield, then 112 miles to Prairie Grove, then 40 miles to West Liberty, then 112 miles to Marietta, then 179 miles to Clear Creek. Even with the relative ease of railroad travel, these distances could be daunting. In 1896, one Illinois friend mourned that most members had never attended a yearly meeting. There were also worries about the spiritual conditions of individual meetings. In 1885, Jonathan W. Plummer wrote about his travels in the ministry. "Among our membership, I found much discouragement as to the condition of the meetings and evident lack of growth or vigorous interest in them." In 1895, the yearly meeting of ministers and elders recorded the discouragement it felt to see so many passing away and the void not filling up as we wish. Statistics were not encouraging. One estimate put the yearly meeting's membership in 1875 as about 1,200. In 1886, it was 1,088. In 1900, it had declined slightly to 1,052. But attendance statistics were more worrying. In 1886, average attendance on first days was 371. By 1900, it was down to 330, meaning that only about a third of all members were attending worship regularly. This was partly due to the high rate of non-resident membership, usually about 35% of the total. The largest meeting in attendance was Blue River with an average of 60. Chicago averaged only 16. And some in Illinois yearly meetings saw too many changes, too much conceded to the world. Abel Mills warned in 1877 that the tempter is lurking at every corner, seeking whom he may devour. A Nebraska friend saw too much breadth allowed members. I say there is but one true rendering of the scriptures, because there is but one kind of truth, and truth must be God. Thomas H. Trueblood frequently voiced his sadness at the changes he saw. Elders did not encourage true ministers, but let one come forth who can handle the enticing words of man's wisdom, tickle the itching ear of intellectual man, and they will extol him to the skies. When he was the only person still attending midweek meeting for worship, the monthly meeting decided it was not kept up to the honor of truth and laid it down. The new meeting house, built in 1899, did not look like a friend's meeting house inside or out, and it opened with what they call a dedication. But these were the voices of elderly friends who could not persuade others to hold to the old ways. So there were certainly reasons for anxiety. But Illinois friends were also resourceful and imaginative in seeking solutions. One that ultimately proved fruitless was the appointment in 1898 of a committee on Western localities. This reflected awareness of the many isolated friends scattered through states west of the Mississippi. If they were gathered into a few localities, they would make substantial meetings. Pastoral Friends had founded several such colonies, all in warm climes, the best known of which was at Whittier, California. The committee was charged with seeking possible sites in the West where a liberal Friends colony might be organized. The committee visited places both in the Rio Grande Valley and in the Pacific Northwest, but it found no promising locales, and so the committee was dissolved in 1899. One that was enduring was the introduction of first day schools. Orthodox Friends had them as early as the 1820s. Hicksites, seeing them as a dangerous infiltration of Presbyterianism, waited until the 1860s. Even then, some were wary. One friend at Hoopeston in 1876 called them a common destroyer and claimed that our meetings have been growing ever smaller since the first day schools have been organized, and there is not the same Christian love maintained that there was before schools were introduced. But this was a minority stance. By 1895, almost every meeting had a functioning first day school. 4 years later, Blue River Monthly Meeting proclaimed, "In our first day school lies the building up of our society, molding the lives of the young and old, and in such a manner that we shall love purity and unity and dispel from our being hatred and all things that would defile and make us unfit for a noble station in life." The yearly meeting organized a conference in conjunction with yearly meeting sessions. It saw appropriate lessons as broad ranging. In 1883, it recorded its concern that the first day school should focus on all that is known as work for humanity, not just religious instruction. But in contrast to the Sunday schools of the evangelical denominations and those of pastoral friends, the emphasis was not on inculcating doctrinal orthodoxy. In 1891, one Illinois friend shared his concern that the Bible should not be held up too high to the young, but the teacher should give them such instruction as to point them to something higher and to trust in an omnipotent power. While careful to write a book of discipline that would govern the business of the yearly meeting, Illinois friends were also willing to be flexible. One example is the use of executive meetings. This was a practice unique to Hicksite friends. It recognized that many meetings simply had no need to hold monthly meeting for business, so it authorized that they could be reduced to 4 a year. And the yearly meeting was willing to bend its procedures when Chicago friends basically organized themselves into a monthly meeting. Friends had begun meeting there in 1864. The arrival of Jonathan W. and Hannah Plummer from Richmond, Indiana, seems to have given the final push. Perhaps the greatest contribution that Illinois yearly meeting made grew partly out, at least out of its sense of relative weakness and isolation. Jonathan W. Plummer was frank in writing to an Eastern friend in 1879. At present, it looks as though from you must spring the working element that is to revive the aggressiveness of our ancient friends, as you embody the elements of intellectual and financial wealth coupled with the growing life that brings them into use. This would be done through the creation of the Friends Union for Philanthropic Labor, which in 1900 became Friends General Conference. Jonathan W. Plummer was the moving force behind the effort to bring the Hicksite yearly meetings together. Before moving to Chicago, he had served as clerk of Indiana Yearly Meetings First Day School Association, and as one historian has noted, has seen how effective volunteer work could be when stimulated and guided by periodic general conferences. In 1878, Plummer wrote to Samuel M. Janney, "I have great faith in the quiet, careful, persistent labor of our society, when its aggressive element is at work, modified and controlled by cooperating conservatism." He saw a conference of Hicksite yearly meetings accomplishing just that. The proposal from Illinois Yearly Meeting in 1878, however, was simply for a cooperative spirit on the subjects of reform that are now agitating the world at large: temperance, arbitration, abolition of capital punishment, etc. The conferences, to be held every 5 years or so, would be banned from consideration of doctrinal subjects, disciplinary provisions, or internal affairs of any yearly meeting. The first day school conferences would remain separate, and the new conferences would focus on philanthropic labor. As was their wont, yearly meetings moved deliberately. By the summer of 1881, only Ohio and Baltimore had responded positively, the latter only after twice rejecting the proposal. That fall, Indiana decided to join, and so the first conference was held in Waynesville, Ohio, in the fall of 1882. It decided on a name, the Friends Union for Philanthropic Labor. It also set a pattern, broken only once for the rest of the century, of meeting in conjunction with the First Day School General Conference. The 1883 conference was held in Baltimore. It set up an executive committee and committees on arbitration, compulsory education, prisonal and criminal reform, and temperance, indicating what Hicksites saw as the most vital areas of reform. After the 1884 meetings in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, the conferences were held biennially. By 1893, all of the other Hicksite yearly meetings had joined, and so the foundation was laid for what would become Friends General Conference. Finally, Illinois Friends, in the midst of all of the faults that they perceived and the discouragements that they experienced, remained confident that they had work to do. Sometimes we feel discouragement about our religious organization. The yearly meeting of ministers and elders recorded in 1895. But this feeling is not good for us. We must rise to higher thoughts, remembering that truth is mighty and will prevail, and that we should not place our dependence on numbers, religion being an individual thing. The report of the exercises of the yearly meeting in the same year echoed this. We are comforted by the reassuring truths of what our religion stands for. As the rays of the sun do not produce the same effect upon all bodies, so too the light of God shining through the various personalities does not cause exactly the same results as shown in our several lives, and hence we should bear charity toward all and judge not. So what does this history hold for us? Here I will be brief, mainly because I am a better historian of the past than I am prophet of the future. First, Jonathan W. Plummer has wisdom for us. In an 1893 address, he said, "We must enter joyfully into cooperation with our brethren from every land and of every religious faith, in the effort to combine the power of all religious organization in opposition to the sins and evils that afflict man and prevent his reaching the highest standard of righteousness that gives peace, joy, and content with a noble manhood and womanhood. This openness to work with others, seeing that openness as a strength, is something that we should hold to. Second, my sense is that this yearly meeting retains the commitment of a century and a half ago to challenging evil and injustice, to trying to make the world a better place. Often we describe one element of this as speaking truth to power. I think that is a good thing. I think there is also wisdom in the advice of the yearly meeting in 1900 that our charity and love should include people we find things doing things we judge to be wrong. Finally, there is the question of numbers. Friends are a tiny proportion of the world's believers, and Illinois friends are a tiny proportion of the world's friends. Yet, unlike most American yearly meetings of friends, Illinois is larger today than it was a century ago, when it had effectively declined to only 2 monthly meetings. You have found work to do, and you are doing it. I am glad to be here to help you celebrate that.
Tom has said he is willing to entertain questions. So you have the floor if there are things you would like to ask him.
Dr. Hamm, sorry, thank you. Were you able, in your research, when these guys you quoted from the, I can't remember all the names, Abel and Plummer and Trueblood, what type of jobs did they have? The ones that lived, especially down here, were they farmers? Were they businessmen? Were they?
Most of these friends are living in rural areas, and so they are farmers. Jonathan W. Plummer was a drug manufacturer in Chicago, but Chicago friends were a relatively small part of the yearly meeting. There are very few urban friends in the yearly meeting at this time, and the same thing's true for friends in Iowa.
Kevin Brubaker, Northside Friends. I'm curious about your final point, quoting Plummer about the desire to work with other Christians in our work. Reading some of your other histories, I had gotten the impression that that was sort of the downfall. That was what led to the split. That it was the Orthodox working with the Methodists that frankly destroyed, at least from our perspective, much of Quakerism. So I'm curious about sort of the risks as well as the rewards of working with others.
I think it shows quite simply the earth does move. And Jonathan W. Plummer is a beautiful example of that. His father, John T. Plummer, had been the clerk of the Hicksite, Indiana yearly meeting in the 1840s at a time when it was absolutely ferocious in condemning friends working with non-friends in philanthropic and humanitarian movements. John T. Plummer wrote an epistle in which he compared friends who joined anti-slavery societies with worshipers of Baal and of the beast with 7 horns. But simply by the end of the century, that more liberal view had triumphed among Hicksites. Probably the most prominent advocate of that openness to working with others in good causes among Hicksite friends before the Civil War had been Lucretia Mott. By the time she died in 1880, one of her admirers commented, Lucretia has outlived all of her critics. That, as often happens in organizations, it probably took half a dozen people dying to make way for a change.
Hi, I'm Brad Laird from Dunlin Friends Meeting and Elkhart River Worship Group. Thank you so much for this history. I guess I want to push you back a little bit. In reading about Hicks, I've been really interested in how Hicksite work influenced Emerson and how Walt Whitman also appreciated that. And I'm wondering if you could make some remarks about how their work either blended into Quakerism or the other way.
That's a good question. And one thing about Elias Hicks is that he wrote and opined extensively on theology. And after he becomes a well-known figure in the 1820s, particularly anytime he's in Philadelphia or New York City, there was stenographers there taking down in shorthand his sermons and then turning them over to printers so they could be published and circulated. So we have him saying a lot of things. He was not systematic in his theology. But I think what Emerson and Whitman found attractive in him was, first of all, the strong stance he took against evangelical Christian doctrines. They felt a kinship with him there. Secondly, I think for Emerson in particular, he found in Hicks someone who had truly experienced that oversoul that Emerson sees in all of humanity. I can't talk about Whitman with as much knowledge simply because I don't know as much about Whitman and Hicks, other than that Whitman did leave a wonderful account of hearing Elias Hicks preach when he was a boy. There is a friend named Mitch Santine Gould who maintains a website on the relationship between Hicksites and Whitman, and I direct you there for a lot more material than I can give you. Back for more?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a history teacher, so I love this stuff. You mentioned the visiting of the Orthodox Church in California. In terms of, you mentioned like we're a little better off than we were 100 years ago. Has anything changed in relationships between like friends, liberal friends, the last 100 years? Or has it basically been the same old,
Let's see, how much time do we have? The diversity that developed among friends in the 19th century has continued down to the present day, and if anything, has widened. Today, among unprogrammed liberal friends, I think generally it's not an expectation that one will necessarily identify oneself as a Christian or even a theist. Former student of mine, Isaac Barnes May, a couple of years ago, published a wonderful book called God, Optional Religion. And it's about the development of the idea of spiritual but not religious. And he sees liberal friends as one of the foundations of the development of that, along with Unitarians and Reformed Jews. Today, the majority of American friends are pastoral. You would find wide diversity among them. West Richmond, my own meeting, is a pastoral meeting, but we have a significant period for unprogrammed worship. And certainly there are no standards of orthodoxy expected there. On the other hand, a lot of the yearly meetings that are part of Evangelical Friends International, membership would include signing a fairly detailed doctrinal statement of belief.
Kathy Guerra, like Forest Meeting. One interesting tidbit about Whitman and Friends is that friend Elizabeth Watson from 57th Street Meeting with her husband's retirement, they moved out east and she was actually a major guide and of Whitman's home.
Mm.
So everything kind of joins up sooner or later.
Mhm. And Whitman is another example. I remember running across at the time of Whitman's death, the different responses of Hicksite and Orthodox friends to Whitman. The Hicksite friends who comment on him almost always comment on him positively. Orthodox friends have no use for him at all.
Tom, I hope I can phrase this question coherently. I think for most of us, when we hear the history of the Hicksite Friends, the early Illinois yearly meeting, we're like, well, we can see a lot of the traces of who we've become, and that's great, and a lot of it's really good. But then we were wrong about this, and kind of what was funny about that, and yet there must have been, in a sense, a way of thinking about the underlying principles that were common to friends that united the the movement toward prohibition, the sense that we being humane to the Indians was consistent with having them become Christian and so forth, and that the things that now appear to us as kind of anomalous were unified in the minds of those. And I wonder if there's some underlying principles that you could articulate that would help us understand kind of the way they thought that was like and unlike the way we think.
I'm not sure I can answer that question because I'm not sure that there is a single underlying principle that would explain why some of the things that they were doing 150 years ago have worn very well and others have not come down to us today looking very good. I think when friends at that time were at their best, they were trying to put forward a vision of religion, which on the one hand, they saw as immediate and personal. They did not need any intermediary between themselves and God. And they were convinced that if experienced properly, that experience through the inward light would lead them to good lives and to do good things. So, certainly when they are trying to abolish capital punishment, or when they are trying to encourage international arbitration, we see that as a good thing. The things that are their greatest failures, and I would guess that for most friends today, their approach to Indian policy is the biggest clanging source of ooze and how could they have been so wrong? Maybe the common note there is where they were trying to impose what they thought was a correct set of beliefs and standards that were peculiar to a certain culture as opposed to the universality of the light. I'm not sure that's a complete or satisfactory answer to your question, but there's a lot there to think about. And if you come back to me in a week, I might have a better answer. Or maybe just the 5 hours driving home tomorrow.
Tom, 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 this is kind of a personal question. So feel free to choose not to answer it. But in the introduction Gwen gave, she said you're a member of West Richmond Friends. And you just said that West Richmond Friends is so Orthodox meeting. They were an Indiana yearly meeting and now they're a new association of friends. And you just said the Orthodox will have nothing to do with Hicks, have no use for Hicks. And you said at the end of your talk that you are glad to be here to celebrate your 150th anniversary. And I want to know how you reconcile being Orthodox with being at a Hicksite yearly meeting.
Accident of geography more than anything else. No, when I'm talking about Orthodox Friends, I'm talking about Orthodoxy as it existed at the end of the 19th century. And even then, there were liberalizing forces at work within Orthodox Quakerism. Rufus Jones at Haverford would probably be the leader in that movement. And over the past 125 years, a lot of people connected with my own Earlham College have been leaders in trying to liberalize or at least take some of the fundamentalist edges off of Orthodox and pastoral Quakerism. So today in the confused Quaker world, just as you would find some conservative, unprogrammed friends like those in Ohio Yearly Meeting who still, use the plain language and who would claim that they're the only real Quakers left in the world. So you would find among pastoral friends, some friends who may, in terms of their genealogy, come out of an Orthodox tradition, would be very comfortable with Elias Hicks. John Puncheon, the English friend who taught at the Earlham School of Religion for a number of years, he and I used to have a debate about whether we would have been Hicksite or Orthodox at the time of the separation. And he said, well, theologically, I think we're closer to the Orthodox than we would have been to Elias Hicks. But I said, John, we would have insisted on going to hear Elias Hicks and judging for ourselves, and that would have been enough for the Orthodox to disown us. On that note,
I understand refreshments will be ready downstairs at 9. I hope you have enough energy left to join us and, a little more conversation then. Thank you all for coming tonight.